In the autumn of 1891, the people of Ridge Hollow stopped what they were doing to watch a man destroy his own cabin floor. Not repair it, destroy it. The first oak plank came up with a cracking groan that echoed across the cold morning air. Kieran Holt, a widowed trapper raising two small children, worked with a kind of determination that felt almost unnatural. To the shock of his neighbors, he pried up each plank with a crowbar until nothing remained but the cold, bare earth beneath. Then came the wheelbarrow. Day after day, he bent under the weight, hauling load after load of Black River stones from the frozen creek. Nobody understood what they were looking at. Winter was 6 weeks away. A man with two children should have been sealing cracks, stacking firewood, and hunting meat. Instead, Kieran Holt was tearing apart the only thing standing between his family and a Wyoming freeze that could kill a man in his sleep. What the people of Ridge Hollow did not know was this. Before that winter ended, the strange floor they mocked would hold warmth for 11 hours after the fire went out, and that one of the most respected builders in the territory would walk inside and realize he had spent his entire life building houses the wrong way. If stories like this still matter to you, subscribe to the channel. And if you believe old wisdom is disappearing faster than people realize, leave a like and stay with us. The strange thing was not that Kieran Holt worked hard. Every man in Ridge Hollow worked hard. Hard work was ordinary there. Winter demanded it. The strange thing was what he believed. Ridge Hollow had men who had spent 40 years building cabins against Wyoming winters. Men who knew how to notch log. Men who could judge green timber with one glance and tell whether it would split before spring. They understood stoves, chimneys, smoke draft, and firewood better than most people back east ever would. Yet none of them had torn open their floors and filled their homes with stone. That raised a quiet question nobody could answer. What did a widowed trapper living off elk meat and muskrat pelts understand about heat that experienced builders did not? Because this story was never really about building a stronger cabin. It was about something far simpler, a wrong assumption. The people of Ridge Hollow believed survival came from making bigger fires. Kieran Holt was beginning to suspect the fire was never the real problem at all. The winter before had already taught Kieran Holt what cold could do to a family. His cabin had not been poorly built. That was the bitter part. The walls were tight-fitted pine logs. The roof had been packed with sod against the wind. There was a cast-iron barrel stove in the center of the room, and a proper stone chimney running through the north wall. By frontier standards, the place was solid. Still, the cold got inside. It came through the floor first. Not as a sudden rush, not as a draft you could point at. It crept upward slowly through the boards until a man's boots never felt fully warm. Then it settled into blankets, into clothes hanging by the wall, into the water bucket near the table. Some mornings, a thin layer of ice formed inside the cabin itself. Kieran and his wife Clara burned through 7 cords of pine and cottonwood before February. They fed the stove day and night. Sleep came in pieces. Every 2 hours, one of them had to rise from bed, shake life back into the fire, and wait for the iron barrel to glow again. Their son Liam slept beside the stove, wrapped in 2 wool blankets. Little Maggie slept inside a wooden crate, near the bed with heated stones wrapped in cloth beside her feet. Even then, both children woke coughing through the night, their breath pale in the dark room. The fire never truly won. It only pushed the cold back for a little while. By March, Clara's cough had settled deep into her lungs. The settlement doctor called it pneumonia. But the people who survived Wyoming winters understood the truth behind such words. Cold wore people down first. Fever only finished the work. After Clara died, Kieran kept thinking about one hard fact he could not escape. They had spent an entire winter feeding the fire, and somehow, they had still been starving for heat. Long before he ever trapped beaver in Wyoming, Kieran Holt had watched his father burn charcoal pits in the hardwood forests of eastern Tennessee. The process took days. Logs were stacked into a tight mound, covered with dirt, then burned slowly beneath the earth, with only a few narrow vents left open for air. The fire itself was rarely visible. Most of the work happened underneath, hidden below the surface where the heat stayed trapped inside the soil. As a boy, Kieran remembered walking near those blackened mounds long after the smoke disappeared. Even at dawn, hours after the flames had died, warmth still drifted from the earth in slow waves. The dirt itself seemed alive with stored heat. One evening, his father noticed him pressing a hand against the warm ground. The old man gave a tired grin and said something Kieran never forgot. "Fire leaves, boy, but the earth keeps it." At the time, it sounded like nothing more than a woodsman's saying. Years later, alone in a cold cabin with 2 children sleeping under heavy blankets, the memory returned with a different meaning. Maybe the problem was not the fire. Maybe the problem was that every cabin in Ridge Hollow was built to chase heat through the air, instead of teaching the house itself to hold it. For 3 nights, Kieran Holt sat awake beside the dying stove after his children had fallen asleep. He stopped watching the flames. Instead, he watched what happened after them. The iron barrel glowed hot for a while. The air near the ceiling warmed first. The room almost felt comfortable. Then the fire settled lower, and the warmth vanished with frightening speed. Cold returned through the floorboards, across the walls, beneath the bed. Too fast. Far too fast. The cabin was made almost entirely of wood. Wood walls, wood floor, wood roof. Even the furniture seemed to lose heat the moment the fire weakened. The stove produced heat well enough. The cabin simply could not hold it. That was the thought that finally settled into Kieran's mind. The house itself was not wrong. The idea behind it was, every family in Ridge Hollow fought winter the same way. More wood, bigger fires, longer burns. But nobody had built a place for the heat to stay once the flames began to die. On the 4th morning, before sunrise, Kieran walked to the shed and found an old iron pry bar hanging beside his trapping tools. He stood there quietly for a moment with the tool in his hand. Then he walked back inside the cabin and drove the steel beneath the first floorboard. Ruth Calder, the older sister of Kieran's late wife, arrived 2 days later carrying a sack of dried beans and salt pork for the children. She stopped in the doorway so suddenly the wind nearly pushed her inside. Half the cabin floor was gone. The table leaned crooked against one wall. Loose planks were stacked outside beneath a canvas tarp. In the center of the room, dark earth lay exposed beneath the cabin like an open grave. Kieran was on his knees in the dirt, shoveling soil into a bucket, while little Maggie watched from the bed wrapped in a blanket. Ruth stared at the hole in disbelief. "Kieran, what in God's name are you doing?" He kept working, fixing the house. "You tore the floor out." Her voice tightened. "Winter's coming in a month. Liam's already coughing at night. You'll freeze those children to death." The shovel stopped for the first time. Kieran rested both hands on the handle and looked across the ruined room. His face showed no anger, only exhaustion and certainty. "The cold was already inside," he said quietly. Ruth shook her head. This place was keeping it out. "No." His eyes moved toward the stove. The floor was hiding it. Silence settled between them after that. Outside, the Wyoming wind scraped across the cabin walls with a low, hollow sound. Ruth looked at the exposed ground again, then toward the 2 children huddled near the blankets. For the first time since Clara's death, genuine fear crossed her face. Not fear of winter. Fear that grief had finally broken him. The digging took 8 days. Kieran Holt cut 30 inches down into the earth beneath the cabin, 1 bucket at a time. The work was slow and punishing. Roots had to be chopped loose with an axe head. Frozen patches of hard clay fought the shovel like stone. By the end of each night, his shoulders trembled from exhaustion. Still, he kept digging. The first version of the floor failed almost immediately. Kieran hauled several loads of riverstone into the cabin early, wanting to test whether the rock would hold heat the way he remembered from the charcoal pits back east. He placed the stones directly over the packed soil and burned a hot fire for nearly 4 hours. At first, it seemed promising. The stones near the stove became warm to the touch. The room held heat longer than before. But by morning, the entire floor felt damp and bitterly cold. Moisture had crept upward through the earth during the night. The stones had not stored warmth. They had stored cold. Kieran knelt there in silence at dawn with one hand pressed against the wet rock, realizing how close he had come to building the wrong system entirely. Then the old memory returned again. Not the fire, the dirt. His father had never burned charcoal directly against wet ground. The pits were always layered first with dry ash, gravel, and charred wood to keep ground moisture from climbing upward into the heat bed. Water stole heat faster than air ever could. That same afternoon, Kieran tore the stones back out. He hauled coarse gravel from a dry ridge west of the settlement. Beneath that, he spread a thick layer of crushed charcoal and ash, salvaged from last winter's stove remains. The black material drank moisture from the earth like a sponge. Only then did he begin rebuilding the floor a second time. The next problem was moving the heat itself. Kieran understood something most men in Ridge Hollow never questioned. Heat from a stove rose fast, gathered near the ceiling, then disappeared up the chimney. Meanwhile, the floor stayed cold enough to numb a man's feet through his boots. That made no sense to him anymore. If the stones were going to hold warmth, the heat had to reach deep into the floor first. So before laying the main stone bed, Kieran carved a narrow loop of shallow trenches beneath the cabin. The channels curved outward from the stove in a rough circle, then returned back beneath it again. He lined the trenches with flat shale and packed the edges tight with sand and ash. The idea was simple. Hot air would pull downward near the stove, move slowly through the hidden channels beneath the stones, then rise again as the floor warmed. Not a burst of heat. A slow circulation, at least that was the plan. The first test failed. Kieran burned dry cedar scraps in the stove for nearly an hour, while holding his hand near one of the vent openings beside the wall. Nothing moved. The heat stayed trapped near the barrel stove while the far side of the floor remained cold. The draft was dead. For a long time, he sat alone beside the open trench, studying the stovepipe, while the fire crackled above him. Then he noticed something. The rear channel sat too level beneath the cabin. There was no natural pull forcing air through the loop. The next morning, he dug the return trench deeper and narrowed one section near the stove to create stronger suction. That second fire changed everything. This time, warmth traveled slowly beneath the floor. Not quickly, not violently, but steadily enough that even the stones near the back wall began holding heat. For the first time since Clara's death, Kieran Holt felt the system beginning to work instead of merely hoping it would. Once the airflow finally worked, Kieran Holt began hauling the real stone. Not loose field rock, not cracked shale from the hillsides. He wanted dense river basalt from the frozen creek bed below Ridge Hollow. Heavy stone, dark stone. The kind that stayed warm long after sunset when left beside a campfire. The work consumed the next 2 weeks. Each morning before daylight, Kieran pulled on his gloves, loaded the wheelbarrow, and made the slow trip down the ridge. The creek banks were slick with frost by then. More than once, the wheel caught between rocks and nearly tipped over completely. The larger stones weighed as much as fence posts. By the end of every haul, his lower back burned so badly he could barely straighten himself. Still, the pile inside the cabin kept growing. One stone at a time, he fitted them together across the floor like pieces of an uneven puzzle. Smaller rocks filled the gaps beneath. Sand and fine ash were swept between the cracks to lock the mass together. Near the stove, he laid the densest basalt he could find, building a thick, dark center where the heat would gather first. The children watched quietly from the bed most evenings, while their father worked on his knees beneath lantern light. Slowly, the cabin began changing shape. The wooden floor that once creaked beneath boots disappeared under a broad layer of stone nearly 2 feet thick in places. The surface was uneven, but solid, dark gray, heavy, permanent. It no longer looked like the inside of a frontier cabin. It looked older than that, something closer to a root cellar, or a forge, or one of the buried charcoal pits Kieran remembered from childhood. When the last stone finally settled into place, the room fell strangely quiet. No hammering, no digging, no sawing. Only the low Wyoming wind outside the walls and the silent weight of all that stone waiting beneath the stove. Winter was coming fast now. By the first week of November, everyone in Ridge Hollow had heard about Kieran Holt's floor. Most people had not seen it yet. They did not need to. Stories traveled faster than wagons in small settlements, and each telling made the thing sound stranger than before. Some said he buried hot coals beneath the cabin. Others claimed grief had driven him half-mad after Clara's death. The loudest version came from Jonah Pike, a broad-shouldered buffalo hunter known for turning every room into an audience. Kieran walked into the trading post late one afternoon carrying a bundle of muskrat pelts to trade for flour, lamp oil, and coffee. The room smelled of wet wool, tobacco smoke, and pine sap warming near the stove. Conversation slowed the moment he stepped inside. Jonah Pike leaned back against a barrel and grinned. "Well now," he said loudly, "there's the man sleeping on a creek bed." A few men chuckled. Jonah pushed harder. "Heard you hauled half the river into your cabin already. What's next, Kieran? Trout swimming under the bed?" This time the laughter spread across the room. Even the storekeeper lowered his eyes and pretended to organize receipts behind the counter. Kieran said nothing. He laid the pelts down calmly, took the flour sack when it was handed over, measured out coffee beans into a cloth pouch. The whole time, Jonah Pike kept talking, feeding himself on the sound of the crowd laughing with him. But Kieran Holt never once defended himself. That silence unsettled a few people more than anger would have, because angry men still sounded uncertain. Kieran sounded like a man who had already made up his mind, long before anyone else understood the question. Ephraim Cutter came to the cabin 3 days after the trading post incident. Unlike Jonah Pike, he did not come to laugh. Cutter was the oldest builder in Ridge Hollow, a man who had spent nearly 4 decades raising cabins, barns, and line shacks across Wyoming territory. He had built homes through blizzards, floods, prairie fires, and hard freezes that killed livestock by the hundreds. When Ephraim Cutter spoke about wood, most men listened. He stepped inside Kieran Holt's cabin slowly, removing his gloves near the door while his eyes moved across the stone floor in silence. The room looked wrong to him immediately. Too much mass, too much weight sitting directly beneath timber walls, never designed for it. Cutter crouched near the edge of the floor and pressed thick fingers between the basalt and the lower sill log. Then he stood again with a grim expression settling across his face. "You buried stone against wood," he said. "That moisture's gonna stay trapped." Kieran kept fitting sand into a crack between 2 stones without looking up. "It's dry underneath." Cutter ignored the answer. "When deep frost comes, damp ground expands, pushes upward, twists foundations apart." He tapped the floor once with his boot heel. Then spring thaw comes. The wood sweats. Rot starts low, where nobody sees it first. The old builder looked around the cabin one more time before delivering the conclusion he clearly believed. "You've built yourself a slow collapse." For a moment, only the sound of wind moved through the stovepipe. Then Kieran finally stood and brushed the dust from his hands. "There's gravel beneath the stone," he said calmly, "and charcoal under that." Cutter's eyes narrowed slightly, not because he agreed, because the answer was more thoughtful than he expected. Still, he shook his head. "Maybe it stays dry one winter," he said. "Maybe 2. But houses aren't built this way for a reason." Kieran never argued back, and somehow, that made the silence between them heavier than shouting would have. The Black January freeze arrived earlier than anyone expected. The first hard drop came during the second week of December when temperatures fell to 22 below zero overnight. 2 days later, the wind changed direction and began driving down through the basin from the Absaroka Range in long cutting bursts that rattled doors on their hinges. Then, the real cold arrived. 35 below, then 44. For 19 straight days, the temperature never climbed above zero. The world outside Ridge Hollow seemed to harden into iron. Trees cracked in the night like rifle shots. Water buckets froze solid beside kitchen tables. Frost spread across interior cabin walls, thick enough to scrape with a knife, and everywhere the fires kept burning. Men woke every few hours to feed stoves already glowing red. Women stuffed blankets into door seams and around windows. Families crowded into single rooms trying to trap warmth close to their bodies while the outer edges of their cabins turned bitterly cold. Still, the heat never held. The Coulter family burned nearly twice their normal winter wood supply before New Year's. Jonah Pike cut apart an old wagon for extra fuel after his stacked pine froze wet beneath the snow. 3 calves died in a barn south of the settlement when the water trough turned solid overnight. The coughing started spreading next. Children first, then older people. The sound carried through Ridge Hollow after dark, rough and deep behind cabin walls, while chimney smoke poured constantly into the frozen air above town. The frightening part was not that people lacked fire. They had fire everywhere. The frightening part was how quickly the cold kept taking the heat away. The wind seemed almost alive during those weeks. It found cracks no man could see. It crawled beneath doors. It pressed downward through roofs and upward through floors. Every cabin in Ridge Hollow became part of the same exhausting battle. Feed the stove. Wait. Feel warm for an hour. Then lose it again. By January, even the strongest houses in the settlement struggled to stay above 45 degrees inside. And somewhere beyond the frozen creek, beneath a cabin floor filled with black river stone, Kieran Holt waited quietly for the cold to make its judgment. About a week into the freeze, people began noticing strange things about Kieran Holt's cabin. At first, it was the chimney smoke, or rather, the lack of it. Every other chimney in Ridge Hollow pushed thick black smoke into the winter sky nearly all day long. The harder families fought the cold, the darker the smoke became. Men stuffed wet pine, broken furniture, even fence rails into their stoves just to keep heat alive another few hours. But Kieran's chimney behaved differently. The smoke rising from his stovepipe was thin, pale, sometimes barely visible at all against the gray Wyoming sky. Then came the mornings with no smoke whatsoever. That frightened people. A cabin without smoke, during a 40-below freeze, meant only one thing. The fire had died, and when the fire died in Wyoming winters, people often died with it. Ruth Calder noticed it first, during a supply run across the ridge. She stopped her horse halfway down the trail and stared toward Kieran's place with growing unease. The chimney stood silent against the snow. No smoke, no movement, nothing. 2 days later, another strange report spread through town. One of the Miller boys claimed he saw Kieran outside near the woodpile without a buffalo coat on, just a wool jacket and gloves. He had stayed outside nearly 10 minutes, splitting kindling before going back indoors. Nobody believed that part at first. Not in weather like this. Men wrapped scarves around their faces just to cross the settlement street. Even short exposure froze moisture into eyebrows and beards within minutes. So the town reached the only conclusion that made sense to them. Kieran Holt's mind was failing. The grief, the isolation, the cold. People whispered that he was no longer thinking clearly enough to understand danger. Some feared the children were already sick inside that strange stone-filled cabin, because in Ridge Hollow, smoke meant life, and a chimney without smoke usually meant death was close behind it. Ephraim Cutter stopped sleeping well after the second week of the freeze. At his age, winter already stole enough rest from a man. The stove needed constant feeding. The wind rattled the walls through the night. But now another thought kept returning every time he closed his eyes. Kieran Holt's chimney. No smoke. Again and again, Cutter pictured that silent stovepipe standing over the ridge while temperatures dropped lower each night. He imagined the children beneath blankets stiff with frost. Imagined the fire dying while the cold crept slowly through the cabin floor. The thought followed him like a weight, because he had seen the warning signs before. Pride, isolation, men refusing help too long. And beneath all of it sat one hard truth Cutter could not escape. He had warned Kieran the floor would fail. but he had never truly tried to stop him. On the morning of January 17th, the thermometer outside Cutter's workshop read 34 below zero. The wind had eased slightly for the first time in days, leaving the world unnaturally still beneath the snow. That was when he finally made his decision. He loaded seasoned pine into a sled by himself, good dry wood, enough to keep a cabin alive through several nights, if rationed carefully. Then he wrapped a scarf across his beard and started the slow climb toward Kieran Holt's ridge. The horses struggled through deep drifts nearly the entire way. As Cutter approached the cabin, his stomach tightened. No smoke, not even a thin trail. The chimney stood cold against the pale winter sky. For a long moment, he remained seated in the sled listening to the frozen silence around him. Then Ephraim Cutter climbed down into the snow, staring toward the cabin door with the heavy feeling of a man arriving too late. Ephraim Cutter climbed the cabin steps and knocked hard against the door with the side of his fist. For several seconds, nothing happened. The old builder felt his chest tighten. Then came the sound of slow footsteps inside. A wooden bar lifted. The door opened inward. Warmth rolled out immediately. Not the sharp blast of stove heat men were used to after stepping indoors from brutal cold. This was different, softer, heavier somehow. A steady warmth that seemed to sit low in the room instead of gathering near the ceiling. It hit Cutter so unexpectedly, he stopped moving altogether. Kieran Holt stood in the doorway wearing an ordinary wool shirt, with the sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms. No heavy coat, no frost on his beard. Behind him, the cabin air looked calm and still, not desperate, not struggling, warm. "You'd better come in before the horses freeze," Kieran said quietly. Cutter stepped inside slowly and shut the door behind him. The first thing he noticed was the silence. No roaring fire, no frantic crackling from overloaded wood. He turned toward the barrel stove in the center of the cabin. The iron was dark, cold. For a long moment, Ephraim Cutter simply stared at it without speaking. Then his eyes dropped to the floor. Liam and little Maggie slept side by side, beneath a blanket spread directly across the basalt stone. Neither child wore heavy winter layers. Their faces looked relaxed, peaceful. The deep coughing Cutter had heard from children across the settlement for weeks was absent here. He knelt slowly near the center of the room and placed one rough hand against the stone. Warm, not hot enough to burn. Not weak either. Deep warmth, stored warmth, the kind that stayed. Cutter pressed harder against the basalt, as if he no longer trusted his own senses. The heat remained steady beneath his palm like sunlight trapped inside rock. "The stove's dead," he muttered. "Killed the fire before dawn," Kieran answered while pouring water into a kettle. Floor kept the rest. The old builder stood up slowly and removed a brass thermometer from inside his coat pocket with stiff fingers. He placed it on the table away from the walls and waited. 1 minute, then 2. Neither man spoke. Finally, Cutter leaned close enough to read the mercury line clearly. 64 degrees. Outside, the Wyoming cold sat at 34 below zero. For the first time in 40 years of building cabins, Ephraim Cutter felt certainty leave him completely. Ephraim Cutter stood up, but his eyes remained fixed on the thermometer as if it were some foreign object. 64 degrees. That wasn't just a number. It was a verdict, but how? His voice dropped. No longer a challenge, but a genuine question. "This is more than just dumping stone into a hole. I warned you about moisture, about the frost. It should have torn this place apart from the inside." Kieran walked over to the cold stove and pointed down to a stone beside it. "That's why I dug down," he explained, his voice even. "Beneath this stone is coarse gravel, and beneath the gravel is a thick layer of charcoal and ash." Cutter's eyes narrowed, the mind of a builder with 40 years of experience, starting to put the pieces together. Charcoal to absorb moisture, gravel to create a dry barrier. That was the answer to his warning about rot. A calculated answer. "It keeps the floor dry," Cutter muttered to himself. Then he pointed toward the far wall. "But the heat? How does it reach all the way over there? Heat doesn't travel laterally through stone that fast. It doesn't go through, Kieran said. It goes under. He led the old builder to a corner of the room where a stone was shaped slightly differently from the others. There are shallow channels beneath the stone, a loop that runs out from the stove and back again. The hot air is pulled down, passes through the channels, warms the entire mass from the bottom up, and then rises gently. Ephraim Cutter knelt, tracing the contours of the stones with his fingertips. Now he saw it, not just a floor, but a machine. A system both simple and ingenious, designed to harvest and store the most precious thing in a Wyoming winter, every last bit of heat. He had spent his life building sturdy wooden boxes, trying to use bigger and bigger fires to fight the cold. He had treated the house as a fortress. Kieran Holt had done something else. He had treated the house as a battery. The old builder slowly stood up, looking at his calloused hands, hands that had raised dozens of homes in the territory. For the first time, he wondered how many families had shivered through long nights because he had taught them how to fight the storm instead of how to hold the fire's warmth. I spent near 40 years trying to trap heat in the air, he said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding. His gaze settled across the basalt floor one final time. And all this time, he paused. I've been building wrong. Kieran Holt gave no answer. He simply stood beside the table, while the silence inside that warm cabin carried more weight than victory ever could. The story spread through Ridge Hollow faster than the storm itself. Not because people suddenly trusted Kieran Holt, because Ephraim Cutter did. That changed everything. The old builder spoke carefully at first. He did not claim Kieran had discovered magic. He explained it the only way a practical frontier man could explain anything. The stone stores the heat, he told people. Same way iron stays hot after a forge fire. Within days, Cutter began building a smaller version of the system inside Ruth Calder's cabin. Her youngest boy had developed a harsh winter cough that kept the whole house awake at night. There was no time to tear out an entire floor in the middle of January, so Cutter improvised. He built a broad raised hearth around the stove, using gravel, sand, and dense river basalt packed together beneath thick stone slabs. The results came quickly. 2 nights later, Ruth noticed something strange. The cabin stayed warm long after the evening fire burned low. For the first time that winter, her son slept until morning without waking in coughing fits. That was the first real conversion. After that, people stopped laughing. 7 families built stone heat beds before spring thaw. 4 more added thermal hearths beside existing stoves. Some copied Kieran's design closely. Others adapted smaller versions depending on money, labor, or available stone. The systems looked different from cabin to cabin, but the principle stayed the same. Store the heat inside mass instead of wasting it into the air. Even Jonah Pike stopped mocking the idea after Cutter rebuilt part of his stove foundation with basalt and gravel the following winter. By the end of 1892, travelers passing through Ridge Hollow began noticing something unusual during cold weather: less smoke. Not because the settlement lacked firewood, because the people there no longer needed to burn half the forest just to survive the night. In the years that followed, versions of Kieran Holt's stone floor spread far beyond Ridge Hollow. Some cabins used full basalt beds beneath the floorboards. Others built thick stone hearths beside their stoves to hold warmth overnight. A few ranchers even lined root cellars with gravel and dark river rock to stabilize winter temperatures for food storage. The details changed from place to place. The principle never did. Heat that moved too quickly disappeared. Heat stored in mass endured. What surprised people most was that Kieran Holt never tried to claim ownership of the idea. He never sold plans, never called himself an inventor. Whenever travelers or builders asked where the system came from, his answer stayed almost the same every time. The heat was always there, he would say. We just kept letting it go. By the late 1890s, Ephraim Cutter openly admitted the stone systems had changed the way he built frontier homes. He still trusted timber, still respected tight joinery and strong roofs. But after the Black January freeze, he no longer believed fire alone could save a family through winter. A house had to remember warmth after the flames were gone. Kieran's cabin stood for decades above the frozen creek beyond Ridge Hollow. Travelers described the place as strange but solid. The stone beneath the floor remained dry. The foundation never twisted apart the way Cutter once feared. In the end, the Wyoming winter had settled the argument the only way nature ever does, without speeches, without mercy, without caring who held the better reputation. The frontier rewarded what worked, nothing else. And somewhere beneath that old cabin, hidden below timber and stone, the earth still held the memory of fire long after the flames themselves had disappeared. What do you think? Could a stone floor really hold enough heat to survive a Wyoming winter after the fire went out? Let us know in the comments.